recording. Okay, so this is the June 29th meeting of the Biomass Task Group. There's an agenda that I'll put in the chat one more time for people who joined later. The bulk of our conversation today is going to be learning about air quality concerns beyond greenhouse gas emissions with respect to biomass electricity plants. We have both Jared Ulmer with us from the Department of Health, and I understand John Hickley, oh yes, he's with us too, Hinckley, who has worked with DEC air quality staff, and him and Megan will update us as well today on the presentation. And then we'll sort of shift and start to think a little bit about where we're going with the recommendations with respect to this specifically. And I have a proposal for sort of a final sort of lesson learning presentation for our meeting 2 weeks from now that would sort of close up our learning around how we would formulate recommendations around electricity plants. And then we'd be able to shift more into wood procurement and thinking about that, the next sort of series of questions related in our scope to address those. First, there are minutes linked in the agenda from the last meeting that Marion was kind enough to put together. I think they focus mostly on the comments that you all had around the questions that sort of were articulated around how we would seek answers with respect to the scope and the kinds of questions. I don't think they should be anything surprising, but that's a direct link to the minutes from the June 15th meeting. And I'll just pause to see if anybody has any comments on those or whether we can consider them approved. Hearing no objections, we'll move right into the agenda. So I think Jared is first up. Jared, thanks so much for being here. And as you introduce yourself and get going, I'll work behind the scenes to get your presentation posted so others can access it. Thanks for sending it this morning.
Great, thank you, Jane. And should I share my screen?
You should be able to have access. I'm happy to do it if you want, but also happy you should have control.
Okay.
And I think everybody probably knows you, but it would be great to sort of introduce your commitment here.
Of course. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, great. Well, thank you. Yes, good morning. Thank you so much for having me this morning. I'm Jared Ulmer. I manage the Climate and Health program at the Department of Health. Trying to get some lighting going here so I'll actually show up, but I think this is as good as it gets.
And are no longer providing.
And there may be, I think the sound was muted. So I manage the Climate and Health program at the Department of Health. I've been in this role since 2015, and my role there is to help Vermont with adapting to, I think there's a phone that probably still needs muting. Oh, there it goes. Helping Vermont adapt to health impacts of climate change, and also trying to support health promotion through climate mitigation strategies. So I was asked to join today and talk a bit about wood heating and air quality and health impacts. Okay. So I will get into that. I did want to just start by, because my topic is related to sort of harmful health impacts associated with wood heating, I did want to just start by acknowledging that it's very good for health for people to have affordable fuel access to stay sufficiently warm in the winter, since that's mostly what we're talking about, but also to stay cool in our increasingly hot summers. So I want to acknowledge that, because clean air is only worth so much if you can't afford to stay safely warm or cool in your home. So there are clearly health benefits of all different heating fuels. There are also harmful effects associated with all heating fuels, regardless of what the fuel is. There's a lot of variability by the type of fuel, and how the system that combustion is occurring in. So all fuels provide good and bad. Hopefully we maximize the good and minimize the bad. So with that, I'll jump into focusing more specifically on wood heating. And I wanted to lead with some of my key points, and then I'll fill in some details as I go. And I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly. I probably won't cover as much detail as is in the slides, so we can have some time for discussion. But the slides, as Jane mentioned, will be posted for you all to review at a slower pace later. So the key points I want to make today, in terms of health impacts from wood combustion, fine particulate matter is far and away the biggest emission of concern in terms of the health impacts that it causes. I'll talk about some others, but that's really where I'm going to focus, is on fine particulate matter, and I'll define that as well. The second is that any amount of combustion emissions is associated with negative health impacts. There's no safe level. A little bit of emissions is a little bad. A lot of emissions is a lot of bad. The third point is that residential sources account for most of the wood combustion emissions. I know there were some specific questions from this group about the electric generation facilities, and they contribute, but it's very small in proportion to residential wood combustion. The fourth point is that even the most advanced modern residential wood combustion systems still on average generate more harmful emissions than do sort of comparable modern oil and gas combustion systems in our homes. And then the last is that there are some other alternatives that I don't know if they're being discussed in this task group, but certainly in the Climate Council at large, home weatherization and cold climate heat pumps that may be worth considering, in that they provide some additional health co-benefits that wood heating cannot provide. So with that, I'm going to jump into some more detail about wood heating and emissions. This is a very high level rundown of some of the emissions from wood heating. Particulate matter I mentioned, and I'll define more in the next slide, is where I'll focus, but there are other gases like carbon monoxide, sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides that are also emitted. There are a wide variety of hazardous air contaminants. I listed a few there as representative. I think the next speakers can speak in a bit more detail about some of those contaminants, but I will circle back on those to some extent. I also just wanted to communicate a little bit about how do we know about the health impacts of air pollution. It's a little bit of a tricky science, because somebody doesn't necessarily show up to the doctor and complain about lung irritation or something along those lines, and the doctor can't typically say, oh, you were exposed to air pollution. They can figure out sort of biologically what's going on with you and hopefully how to address it, but not necessarily what the causal factors were. So there are sort of two main ways that this topic has been studied, and I will say this is a very well studied topic. There are always questions to be answered, but this is a very well studied topic, largely due to epidemiology studies, which are sort of looking at how much air pollution are people exposed to and what kind of health impacts do we observe after that exposure. And that can range from being exposed to really acute events like a wildfire. Sometimes there's some interesting things that happen, like when the Olympics come and traffic is banned and it has major impacts on air quality. There's some ways to assess some health benefits associated with cutting off emission sources. People that work in occupations where there's a lot of air pollution exposure, that's a relatively easy group to study. A bit harder is studying the long-term exposures, just us living in Vermont exposed to a certain amount of ambient air pollution going about our lives. But there are studies that have looked at that, sort of comparing places with more air pollution to places with less air pollution. It's also possible to look at more of sort of laboratory experimental studies where you can do more observation of some of the biological effects of exposures to air pollution. But most of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be based on the epidemiology studies. very quick overview of fine particulate matter. It's essentially really tiny particles, either solid or liquid. The graphic in the top left shows some comparisons to human hair, which is 50 to 70 micrometers in diameter. Sometimes we talk about particulate matter as being anything less than 10 micrometers, which is like dust that you can observe in your home. The more of the health concern is for particulate matter below 2.5 micrometers, which we generally cannot see. And those are really small particles that can, in the bottom left graphic, can be inhaled deeper into our respiratory systems. And there's even smaller particles, as you can see, as you sort of move from left to right on that graphic. The smaller the particle, the deeper we can inhale them in our systems, and the more health effect they can have because of that more systematic impact, causing stress and irritation to cells and tissues in our body. So some of the health effects related to particulate matter below 2.5, which is often referred to as fine particulate matter, are generally irritation and impacts to your respiratory system from your nose and throat down into your lungs. It can cause shortness of breath, potentially asthma attacks. Something interesting that we learned through the COVID pandemic is that people exposed to more air pollution tended to suffer more severe COVID-19 symptoms. It can cause cardiovascular effects and potentially early death from really high acute exposures or from long-term chronic exposures. And then people that are particulate matter is particularly harmful for are people with any kind of pre-existing breathing or heart problem, children, older adults, and pregnant women, to name a few high priority groups. Vermont, well, nationally, we do have air quality standards. I'm gonna probably have to go too quickly through these slides, but there are yearly air quality standards. We're generally below those standards in Vermont, below 12 micrometers over a 3-year average. Those numbers have been generally coming down over time. One thing I noted, and I'd love to hear from the next speakers if they know, is that it seems like the numbers have gone up a little bit in the last few years. And I don't know the reason for that. So I did want to point that out.
Jared, can you just clarify when you say below the standard, that means we're complying with them or our emissions are less than what is considered problematic?
That's correct. Our emissions are lower than the standard. So we are in the good territory according to this standard, at least.
Thank you.
Sure. And similar there's also a daily standard that we're not to exceed 35 micrometers for the 98th percentile every year. So these numbers are showing basically what is our 98th percentile highest level of particulate matter at each of these facilities. Also tends to be lower than the standard. I did want to acknowledge someone in response to that question, Billy, that these standards are being reevaluated, and my understanding is are likely to be lowered at least marginally. I don't know that it'll affect our current values. Something again that hopefully the DEC folks could speak to more, but just wanted to acknowledge that I think there is a growing consensus that these standards are probably a little too high and not health protective enough. I'm just going to skip that slide and say, to emphasize that point, there's so much research out there that indicates that there's no safe level of air pollution, as I said in my opening statement. So the standards, to some extent, are being a little undermined by some of this research that even at pollutant levels below the standards, it's still clear that there are health impacts. So again, staying within the standard is important, but even below the standard, lower numbers are better. I'm going to switch back to this slide that I skipped just to indicate these are this is kind of a busy graph, but this shows in Rutland and Burlington daily fine particulate concentrations where, in short, green is very good, below 12 micrometers. And the yellow to orange and above are the days where the air quality is getting a bit worse. And the main point I want to make here is that the poorer air quality days are largely concentrated in the wintertime, which sort of emphasizes that wood heating or other winter heating is one of the main drivers of the higher levels of fine particulate concentrations. All right, so jumping ahead, I did want to describe where some of the different major pollutants come from in Vermont. Starting over on the left with fine particulate matter, 45% of all fine particulate matter emissions in Vermont, according to the National Emissions Inventory, is coming from biomass combustion. And you can see some smaller slivers for some other large categories. A lot of fine particulate matter in Vermont actually comes from resuspended road dust. We have a lot of dirt roads. So that's a little bit of an oddity with fine particulate matter. But you can see that biomass also contributes to relatively large portions of carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide, a bit less on nitrogen oxide. So another reason why I'm largely focusing on fine particulate matter. In terms of where that fine particulate matter is coming from biomass emissions, 93% of it is coming from residential sources, according to the National Emissions Inventory. There's a 7% coming from industrial, commercial, and institutional boilers. That might be something at a hospital or a school or a business, for example. And less than 1% of those emissions come from electric generation. This is a really compelling graph. I think the numbers are debatable, but this is from EPA about emissions from different types of heating units, where the larger numbers are more emissions of fine particulate matter. You can see that moving from an uncertified wood stove to an EPA certified wood stove, still cordwood, but to a more modern, higher standard, reduces particulate matter substantially. Moving to a pellet stove reduces that even further. I've never seen really great comparable numbers for what I think we often refer to as advanced wood heating with more modern wood boilers. But I think it's pretty clear from the research that the number falls below pellet stoves. They generate fewer emissions than pellet stoves, but still substantially more than an oil furnace or a gas furnace. Yes, Jane.
I guess a question just about, so this is at the point of combustion. I wanted to highlight that only because that's why a life cycle analysis is really important to do, so we can understand not only when we burn the wood, but also the creation of these fossil fuels to burn. And I would imagine, and I'm just speculating, but if you were to look at emissions from heating equipment of their full life cycle, would the this is a question, would gas and oil furnaces likely be higher from the extraction point, or is that not true?
I don't know the answer to that question. You're right in your assumption that this is from the point of combustion, though. So a life cycle analysis could generate a different picture.
Jared, this is Richard. Just for clarity, this is about what's coming out of the smokestack or outside the building. This is not about what's happening inside the building, correct?
Correct.
Thank
Emissions outside of the building.
Right.
Good point too.
Okay. So one other just sort of context slide, 24% of our heating in Vermont comes from wood, and the chart on the right show the different types of wood stoves, wood boilers in use in Vermont, where most are using cordwood. There are still 26% of the cordwood stoves roughly are still pre-1990, so before EPA certification came into play. there are 15% of the units are more modern pellet stoves, and 1% that are the most modern pellet boilers and furnaces. So a lot of cordwood still in play. The next few slides I'm going to talk about are throughout the rest of the presentation. I'm doing some very quick estimates of health impacts using some EPA tools. I won't go into detail here, but I just wanted to acknowledge that EPA has some tools available to the public on their website, the Co-Benefits Risk Assessment and Benefits Mapping and Analysis Program that are really useful for doing sort of quick analyses of health impacts associated with emissions. And I'll just say that this is not meant to be anything really well developed and defensible. This is a very quick analysis. This is meant for making sort of order of magnitude comparisons. So I'd ask you not to get hung up on specific numbers, but maybe comparisons here are going to be more relevant. So I did use the Co-Benefits Risk Analysis program to estimate health impacts associated with these different categories of emissions in Vermont, looking at health costs on the left in millions of dollars and early deaths on the right. And as you can see, the health impacts associated with biomass are substantially higher than these other categories. The bars are showing the program gives a low estimate and a high estimate. So the expected actual number lies somewhere within that range. I did want to quickly mention, I think this is something, again, the next speakers will maybe touch on a bit more in terms of toxic emissions, but another category of concern for health is cancer risk associated with hazardous air pollutants from combustion emissions. I don't think I'm going to have a lot of time to get into detail here, but the point is we have relatively clean air in Vermont in terms of hazardous air pollutants. We're one of the lowest cancer risk states in the country in terms of cancer related to air toxics. There's a segment, about a quarter of the emissions that come from background and biogenic, that's plants and soil, fires, sort of sources that are a bit outside of our direct control. About a quarter come from direct emissions from human activity, and about half are called secondary formed pollutants. I don't have the knowledge or time to get into a lot of detail there, but these are influenced by the direct emissions from human activity, but there's more complex chemical reactions going on in the atmosphere following those emissions, and it's hard to attribute those to a very specific source. But on the right, again, you can see that residential wood combustion is sort of the predominant contributor to cancer risk associated with our direct emissions from human activity. There's a little sliver below it that electric generation from biomass and all other fuel combustion, unfortunately, they're all combined in this National Air Toxics Assessment. So that's oil, gas, and biomass, except for residential, all fall in that little sliver, which contributes a small amount to the cancer risk. But again, compared to residential wood combustion, it's very little. I would expect that wood combustion is contributing to secondary formed pollutants as well, but it's really hard to know how much that contribution is. I think I'm going to skip this in at a respective time, but there's a slide here on formaldehyde, which is one of our air toxics of greatest concern, showing some of the measurements there and contributions from different sources. I did quickly want to make a few other health points that I won't go into detail on. The first is that there's a lot of variability in emissions. I gave you those specific numbers from the EPA slide, but even within EPA certified cordwood stoves, research shows that the emissions could vary by a factor of 6 to 10, perhaps, based on what kind of stove you're using, what fuel you're using, how well that fuel was seasoned, what its moisture level is, how you use your stove. Do you always run it hot? Do you close the damper? There are a lot of human factors involved that really cause variability in emissions. The second point is that I know Richard asked about indoor air quality. There is research showing that there are indoor air quality impacts associated with wood heating. A lot of that is from the emissions coming out of your chimney, going outside, and then essentially coming back into your house through the walls and the window, the ceiling around the windows and the doors, all the different places that air leaks, in and out of your home normally. Some of those particulates are coming back in as part of that process. So your indoor air is affected by the outdoor air immediately surrounding your house. And there are also indoor impacts associated with cleaning out the ash when you're removing that from your unit. There's a lot less research on indoor air quality impacts, but there certainly are some. The third point here is that sort of related, you can experience, I was sort of giving sort of average impacts over the state of Vermont. There are people that are going to experience higher impacts because they're burning wood, their neighbors are burning wood, that there's going to be a higher concentration of those pollutants the closer you are to the source. That may not exactly be the case with the electric generation facilities. Again, hopefully the next speakers can address that, but my understanding is because of the tall stack heights, there's a lot of dispersion that happens of those pollutants before they drop back down to levels where we would actually breathe them in. So I think that that statement mostly applies to residential sources. The fourth point here is that there's a lot of emerging research, I would say, about extremely tiny particles. As I mentioned earlier, they get really deep into our systems and cause more health impacts. There's some concern that some of the newer units, because they're so good at combusting, they generate a lot less of the fine particulate matter, but they actually generate more of this ultrafine particulate matter, and there might be some particular impacts associated with that. I see Judy's hand. I'll just make this one last point, and then the last point is just that there are a lot of wood boilers being used at schools, and I know there's some research showing that wood boilers at schools particularly generate more harmful emissions than oil boilers. I've never seen much in terms of health impact studies associated with those, but that's an area that we've been a little concerned over the years, is with a sensitive population like school children, what could be the impact of wood boiler use at schools. Yes, Judy.
What about health impacts for the environment?
Can you elaborate on your question, please?
Do these fine particles plug pores or something on trees, for instance?
Oh, gotcha.
How do these fine particles impact our trees and our plants?
Okay.
And our drinking water? Sure.
Very good questions. I don't think I can answer them. I might see if some of our DEC folks could answer them. I can look into the one about drinking water, but maybe I can defer that question to our DEC speakers to hopefully answer in the next presentation. Is that okay, Judy? Okay. Sorry, good questions. I wish I knew the answers to those. Jane, if you need me to wrap up now, let me know. I just have 3 more slides, I think. Okay. I did want to just touch on a couple of other sort of projected scenarios into the future. We did take a look a few years ago at this report that came out about expanding advanced wood heating in Vermont, and use some of the projections there to assess health impacts. And that report suggested increasing wood heating from 21% of the total thermal load in Vermont to 35% by 2030, and gave specific numbers for pellet stoves and pellet or chip boilers to reach that target. So when I plugged that into the COBRA, co-benefits risk assessment model, it estimated that even accounting for offsetting the units the heating units that those would replace, we could expect 715 more tons of fine particulate emissions, which would be associated with $15 to $35 million in health costs and 1 to 3 early deaths. And I'll say with all of these, I'm staying very narrowly focused on air pollution, emissions, and impacts. You all have a lot of other considerations, like Judy's excellent question as well. So I'm just trying to give you a little bit of information to weigh in those larger considerations. Yes, Jane.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that in the climate action plan, it's not consistent with an increase in wood heating.
Okay.
And just highlight, and if please, someone, if I'm remembering this incorrectly from the modeling we did, but to meet our emissions reductions targets, we were looking at approximately long-term out a 13% component of our heating source would be from advanced wood heat.
Okay.
So we actually were looking at a decrease over time in wood heating.
Okay, that's great. I'm happy to rerun numbers with more current information. I do apologize. I've been COVIDing the last 2 years, so I'm a little out of date. I think I saw Billy's hand next.
Thanks. Given all this information and the level of wood fuel we use in the state, could you speak to where we stand kind of in comparison regionally and nationally in fine particulate air quality?
I don't think I could make that comparison off the top of my head here. Again, the DEC folks may be able to answer that, or I could follow up on that one.
Thank you.
Adam.
Hi, Jared. Thanks for this presentation. The question I had is, are the numbers in terms of the estimated health impacts, are those comparing the wood heat emissions to like best in class oil, gas, and propane boilers, or is it comparing it to the 20-year-old oil, gas, and propane boilers that they would be replacing? So I just want to make sure that like there was an apples to apples comparison.
Sure.
To how that's done.
They're all based on essentially the numbers that from that earlier slide of the EPA emissions rates by fuel type and stove type. So it's apples to apples within, for as much as we trust those numbers, it's apples to apples within those EPA emissions numbers.
So comparing a new pellet boiler against like a comparable brand new natural gas or oil boiler. So it was brand new to brand new, right?
I don't think those oil numbers from EPA are necessarily brand new best of class. I think it's more average over a range of units, but that's something I'd have to follow up on.
Okay. Not just brand new in terms of a range of the best in class, but in terms of like comparing 20-year-old aging failing boilers. I mean, I think the presumption in that EPA graph, as I understand it, is that they are new units.
Okay. That may be the case. I'll have to check and I can follow back up, because yes, that's a very important point. We should be comparing what is actually out in use today in Vermont being offset with hopefully best in class new units. And then just to go one further with some of these projections, I wanted to just give some comparisons of some different scenarios that could potentially be considered alternatives to wood heating. One is just improving our human behaviors associated with fuel storage and stove usage. I don't know how to estimate the benefits associated with that. There isn't great research on that, but I wanted to indicate that a phenomenal educational program with great human response alone would have benefits for air quality and health. Weatherizing homes provides benefits. You get more air quality benefits from changing out wood stoves, older wood stoves to newer best in class, and changing out wood stoves for cold climate heat pumps would generate even more benefit because of the switch to electric in terms of air pollution and health impacts associated with air pollution. I did want to also point out that because these are other topics of concern for climate and health, there are some additional health benefits associated with weatherization that are well researched in terms of indoor air quality improvements, better moisture control inside, reduced thermal stress within those homes that provide a lot of add-on benefits when you weatherize a home. Also, changing out wood stoves for cold climate heat pumps is something really relevant for us because we're getting a lot hotter, and the large majority, like 90% plus of heat-related deaths in cold climates like ours are generally older adults in hot housing. It's not that many deaths outside, but it's a lot of deaths inside. So keeping housing safely cool in the summer is becoming a greater concern. Yes, Richard.
Yeah, hi, this is great stuff. Thank you. If you have a house with an older, most of this session is going to be about electricity generation, but I still do have some follow-up questions about home heating. If you take a house that is heated with wood is being burned inside the house, particularly in an older stove, and then you weatherize that house, don't you make the indoor air quality worse?
I don't know that answer. I'm going to speculate and say you would still make it better because you would reduce that. Hopefully, you would reduce some of that infiltration of outside air to inside. So if you're better sealed, you've got you have less uncontrolled air exchange between outside and inside. So I think in that case, weatherizing would substantially reduce that poor outdoor air quality from infiltrating inside.
Yeah, I just raised the question about interactions between tightening up houses and indoor sources of pollutants. Mm-hmm. At our camp on Lake Dunmore, we have a set 1970s era freestanding wood stove, and if you don't manage it right, the room gets smoky, and you have to open the windows.
Okay.
If you made that room tighter, you would, I'm sure, make the indoor air quality worse rather than better.
Yeah, I think in that situation, I would agree. I think if you do have issues with, the stove backdrafting, if that's the right term, any of the smoke into the home, you're right. Sealing it greater may trap those pollutants in the house more. I think in the situation where the stove is at least operating properly and all the emissions are going out your flue, you should expect some improvement with weatherization.
Yeah, I'll just finish here by saying that you showed earlier that a substantial fraction of the houses that are heated with wood are still being heated with older stoves.
That's right, about a quarter from the last estimates that I saw, and that quarter generates a disproportionate amount of the pollutants from wood heating. Jane, if I can just wrap up with one last slide, just to mention that the 2016 Comprehensive Energy Plan acknowledged and then was reaffirmed in the 2022 plan that it's important to assess health impacts of our energy systems. And I just wanted to mention this. Sometimes it's called a tool, sometimes a process called health impact assessment that could be useful here to this task group or maybe elsewhere throughout the Climate Council. Health impact assessment has been around for 20 or so years and takes a lot of different forms, but it's basically a process for more formally assessing health impacts associated with a policy, a program, a facility, and uses scientific evidence, feedback from experts, feedback from the public, and collects a lot of information, does projections so that you can make better informed decisions about what kind of impacts might you expect, who will be affected, particularly if it's going to be somebody that's historically disadvantaged or more susceptible to health impacts. Identifying who is going to be affected is really critical, and then figuring out not just what decision to make, but if you make a decision that has potentially some negative health impacts, what other decisions can you make to try to mitigate those impacts? So anyway, I just want to mention health impact assessment as a tool that this task group might want to consider. And then I'll stop there. The same points that I made at the beginning, I'll just leave them up for any further questions if there's time.
That's great. Thank you so much for all of that, Jared, and being open to questions as we went through.
Sure.
We're a few minutes behind schedule, and I do appreciate John Hinckley has been with us and probably enjoying your presentation too. So if there's any other questions, I guess I'll just ask Jared, are you able to stay through 10 o'clock? Or do you need to leave right now?
No, I'm happy to stick around.
That's great. So why don't we move to Megan and John, and appreciate that they might be able to actually also answer some of the questions that are still lingering out there with respect to Jared's presentation, and then leave time after they present for further questions for both Jared and John and Megan.
Thanks, Jane. So I don't have a presentation prepared, but I think what makes sense to do is I can talk briefly about, what and Jared, already provided a really nice preview of this, but, what the National Ambient Air Quality Standards are, and, how Vermont kind of operates within that space in terms of our delegated authority under the Clean Air Act. And then I might turn it over to John to talk more specifically about the two facilities that we're talking about, McNeil and Rygate. And Jane had shared, I think, the link to the permits that we've issued for those two facilities, and also our most recent emissions data that Colin had put together last week on those facilities as well. So if that sounds okay to you, John, I'll just kind of do an intro about, how we regulate sources generally, and then kick it over to you.
Sounds good.
Okay. So as Jared mentioned, there are things called the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and these are standards that are set pursuant to EPA's authority under the Federal Clean Air Act. And the states work very collaboratively with EPA to ensure that these standards are attained. And so that's a term that's used in the Clean Air Act. If a state is within attainment for a national ambient air quality standard, then that means that it's meeting the standard. If it's not in attainment for a particular standard, then there's many things that the state has to do to demonstrate that they're working to be in attainment for that standard. And there's two different standards that are set for each pollutant that is required under the Clean Air Act to have a standard. And I'll just go over really briefly what all those pollutants are. So it's carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, particulate matter, both particulate matter 2.5 and then the PM10. So that's, Jared, what's the measurement again for 2.5 and 10? Is it
Micrometers.
Micrometers, thank you.
Yep.
So there's two different standards. So there's two different types of PM, and then sulfur dioxide is the last pollutant for which there is a national ambient air quality standard. And to answer Judy's earlier question about, public health versus standards set for the public welfare more generally, including other resources in the environment. So there's two standards for each pollutant. There's the primary standard and there's the secondary standard. And the primary standard is focused on the goal of protecting public health, and in particular, protecting sensitive populations like asthmatics, children, the elderly. And then the secondary standard has the goal of protecting the public welfare more generally. And so that includes goals of improving visibility, and then also minimizing damage to, animals, vegetation, crops, other natural resources. So that has more to do with kind of environmental mitigating damage to other environmental resources generally. And I can share in the chat the link to the current standards for each pollutant so that you can see where those are at right now. And just Jared had kind of mentioned this, but in the previous administration, federal administration, there wasn't really a lot of work done on investigating and making, consensus and science-based decision-making about whether or not the current standards for criteria pollutants were stringent enough or are stringent enough. So there were, it wasn't very it wasn't very helpful. But I think I could say that those conversations and those processes among the scientific community for revisiting standards has resumed, I think, in a better and fashion and what would be more scientifically appropriate, and that what we would support. And there is a legal process and a legal timeline in the Clean Air Act that national ambient air quality standards have to be revisited to determine whether or not they are stringent enough. And so I think that the federal government and EPA is back on track in terms of doing those evaluations. So as I mentioned, Vermont ANR, and within ANR, the Air Quality and Climate Division specifically. So the Air Quality and Climate Division is our air pollution control agency within the state. And we are delegated authority to carry out particular provisions of the Clean Air Act in Vermont to control emissions of these pollutants and then also hazardous air contaminants. And we generally control emissions from stationary sources via our air permitting program. So if your facility exceeds a particular threshold in terms of the tons per year of a particular contaminant or a group of contaminants that it emits, then you need to obtain an air permit. And there's two types of permits that we issue. We issue a construction permit. So for new projects, you need to, if you exceed the thresholds, then you need to obtain a construction permit. And those tend to be more about the kind of initial design of the facility. And then they usually evolve into an operating permit, and an operating permit is something that stays with the facility so long as it's subject to the permitting program. These permits have to be renewed periodically and reviewed by the Air Quality and Climate Division to make sure that facilities are operating pursuant to the best technologies that are available for controlling emissions. And there's several different mechanisms and in terms of in the Clean Air Act that we use to understand whether or not facilities are in fact meeting those requirements. So that's kind of our program generally. We also do, robust compliance related to our delegated authority to make sure that specific types of sources are meeting specific controls and requirements in the Clean Air Act. There's a whole nother kind of standard program that is federally delegated to us to control emissions from different types of sources. We regulate, for example, dry cleaners and different types of mineral processing facilities. And I mean, that's just a couple. There's dozens and dozens that have particular and, industry standards in terms of air emissions of air contaminants that we make sure are being met. And I also just want to mention really briefly before I answer or before we hear Judy's question, the Air Quality and Climate Division is currently in the midst of amending our wood heater regulations. We actually just filed that rule with ICAR last week, and ICAR will be hearing about that rule at their hearing on July 11th. But this rule does a few things. It closes a gap in our regulatory authority for wood heater appliances that has existed forever on what we would call kind of medium-sized wood heating appliances. We have recently taken been delegated authority from EPA to regulate smaller, kind of more residential sized wood heating appliances in Vermont, pursuant to the national standards for how EPA regulates those types of appliances. And then we had a threshold under which very, very large wood fuel burning equipment had to be subject to our permitting program. But then there was this gap in between where we didn't regulate at all or set any standards for those sizes of units. And so we've entirely closed that gap. And we have put standards in place for the smaller sizes of wood burning appliances, the medium size, and then the very large, which are subject to our permitting program. And we've actually lowered that threshold for what size units need to go through our permitting process. So that's something that's going on right now. I think it's definitely an effort to be more protective of public health in terms of ensuring that all wood fuel burning equipment that's installed in the state does meet a particular standard to protect public health. And that's, I think, where I'll leave it. Judy?
Yeah, thank you. I have a couple of questions. You mentioned heat pumps. Is there any data available to show that they really are successful in eliminating carbon emissions and other things like that? We have 2 of them, and I love it in the summer because I can get all the AC I want, but I can't afford to run it in the winter. It's so expensive. So I just want to know what you have for data out there on that. That's the first question. And the second question is, Colin gave us a paper months ago about the largest carbon emitters in the state, and schools were right up there. Is there any data as to what is happening with schools collectively, and do schools boards who decide to go in this direction, do they understand the issues that are going to be caused by that? Is there information out there for school boards, and is there data out there on schools that are burning wood?
So Judy, are you referring to schools that have installed wood heating systems specifically, or?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just mention that the amendments to our regulations will most likely mean that those size units that are being installed in institutional settings will be regulated by ANR going forward. So I think that that's good. I'm wondering if other folks on the call could maybe speak to the issue of schools installing these units. I mean, we certainly work with anyone who reaches out to us to ask about the air quality implications of installing a certain piece of equipment and its application and how it might, impact air quality conditions. But I guess I don't know specifically what other information might be available to school boards when making these types of decisions. I know there's a few of these units installed in colleges and other entities across the state. So
yeah, so like Middlebury installed it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they stopped it when they realized all the issues. And perhaps they can afford to do that, and some little school in some little town can't. And so it just seems like there should be an educational program that's available for school boards. And it also seems there should be more data available on that, but also data available on heat pumps. Do you have anything available on whether they actually solve some of the environmental issues or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an ongoing discussion for sure. And I don't have any conclusive information at my fingertips right now that I can share on this call. But I think that, these are some questions that we're going to be getting into with our life cycle analysis as well. So I can't answer that right now, but I think that's a really good question. And maybe Adam has some more information related to your institutional wood boiler question.
Because it just, for me, it seems like often people put the cart before the horse and they recommend things before they have the data to document it. And that's what I was trying to clarify.
Sure, understood.
Thank you.
Adam, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, there is data on the institutional use of wood heating chips and pellets across a wide range of commercial and institutional college campuses, hospitals, schools. That data is there. It's tracked through Forest Parks and Recreation, also a number of other organizations in the baseline study, the Clean Energy Development Fund commission. So there's a lot of information out there, resources, guidebooks, looking at the pros and cons of what it entails to switch. In terms of cold climate heat pumps and their performance and the environmental impacts, there's a lot of information out there. It totally depends on how green and clean the grid is. And I think that the switch from wood heating from a policy perspective raises the kind of the interesting conundrum of, if we push people to electrify their heating from high efficiency thermal applications in their homes, we're creating more electrical grid demand that needs to be met with peaking capability, absent storage, that we're creating new loads, new peaks. That's not easily met with wind and solar absent storage. And so therefore we're creating more demand for electric generation like McNeil and Reigate. So I think, some of the discussion that we've been tiptoeing around has been raising this interesting conundrum of we have a policy choice. We have a policy choice of looking at the pros and cons and the impacts and benefits of wood heating and heating with 60 to 90% efficiency in someone's home in terms of the resource base. Or we can push more to burn wood from our forests and burn it at 25% efficiency, and then run more heat pumps in people's homes to meet that load. So I raised that as kind of food for thought and consideration for this committee.
But Adam, then what happens is it becomes an issue of equity.
Could you speak more to that, Judy? I'm just trying to understand that in the context of this immediate conversation.
If you're striving to put food on your table and a gallon of gas in your car to go to work, how can you afford a heat pump?
Okay, yeah, no, I hear that. Thank you. That's helpful.
So I didn't really have anything else to offer in terms of just like our general legal and regulatory framework in Vermont for how we address these emissions. But so I want to turn it over to John. But obviously, you might expect given. Oh, Billy, sorry.
Sorry, because would you have an answer to the question I asked Jared about our relative fine particulate emissions as we compare it to the region or nationally?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk to our planning section in terms of the, like, maybe the number of exceedance days or,
I'm just trying to get a sense of whether like we're high, low, average, generally speaking. Jared focused heavily on the emissions associated with combustion of wood fuel, and that being a problematic in and of itself, but I'm just trying to understand kind of like where we are in the grand scheme of things. So any information you can bring back to us on that would be great.
Yeah, I can check in with Bennett and Dan, who manage our air quality forecast, and kind of, predict and monitor those days where we have, where we're warning about different levels of air quality that might be of concern to folks. And what that's like relative to other states in the region. I mean, I think, Jared had showed that in the last 3 years in particular, we've had, higher levels of PM compared to other recent years. And I mean, our high PM days are in the wintertime, especially, are related a lot to what the weather is doing. And I'm assuming that if the weather is similar across New England, that other states are going to be experiencing similar conditions, especially in states where residential wood burning is like Maine, you know, where that type of activity is happening. So I can check in with our planning section and get back to you, Billy, and share that information with the entire group.
Thank you.
Yeah. So just turning it to oh yes, Judy, go ahead.
Can someone answer or comment on what Annette is put in there in the chat box? Because I am also interested in that. The data we got from Colin did say that the emissions from McNeil were 503 metric tons. So could someone please respond to those
I
questions?
thought today we were focusing just on the health impacts associated with wood fuel, not the carbon emissions. Is that correct? So that's why.
Well, and that could be, Billy, but I think it's not healthy to have 503,000 metric tons of CO2 put into the atmosphere that people live right beside.
Yeah, so I think I agree with Billy in terms of the focus of today. I think Colin had shared the GHG emission data from these two facilities previously, and the table that Jane shared today does focus specifically on the criteria pollutant emissions and the hazardous air contaminant emissions. So maybe we can revisit that, the GHG piece at a follow-up meeting.
It still is a health issue.
Yes, I agree with you that climate change is a health issue for sure.
Well, I'm not saying climate change. I'm saying the carbon emissions from McNeil is a health issue for the people living there.
Okay.
That's why we have a community health center right there.
So since we're running short on time, I want to give John time to go over the emissions from these two facilities, but I just want to briefly say that these two facilities have been issued air permits, and they're also in a small group of sources that are actually classified as Title V sources, which also means that they're subject to other requirements of the Clean Air Act federal permitting program. And there's not a lot of sources that we have in Vermont that are Title V sources, but I just wanted to mention that. And Jane did share links to those permits, and if folks are interested in digging in, and you know, when folks have time to review those, happy to try to answer any specific questions about those permits, and also loop in folks from our permits and engineering section in the air division as well. But I will turn it over to John, and just want to say that really appreciate John being here. John is an expert and consultant in the realm of emissions of air contaminants from stationary sources, and we've had the pleasure of working with him a lot as it relates to many different sources that we oversee in the state of Vermont. So thanks very much, John, for joining us today.
Welcome. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Jared and Megan, for your presentations. They were great, and I learned a lot from both of them. So appreciate the opportunity to learn from you and to be here. Just real quick, guys, Megan mentioned I work for a company called All4. Important distinction is we're a private consulting company, so we work for facilities, helping them to understand how to comply with the Clean Air Act, and different requirements apply in different locations and situations. We've got 5 employees here in Vermont and about 200 nationally. We do a lot of work for power plants nationwide, but we've not done any work for McNeil or Rygate, so I don't have any personal experience working with these facilities, but I've had a chance to review their permits briefly, and a lot of the requirements in those permits are similar to the requirements for permits for other facilities that I've permitted. So my expertise involves developing air permit applications to emit air pollution and control it. We do a lot of pollution control technology evaluations. So we do look at ways facilities can minimize their emissions. And wanted to mention also that we do work in what's called air quality modeling. You may have heard it referred to as air emissions dispersion modeling. Since we talked a little bit about health risk assessments, I just wanted to mention that that's a tool that can be used more on a micro level, meaning say within, the Champlain Valley at that level, spatial scale, where we can model the emissions from a facility and evaluate whether or not the resulting concentrations meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS. Regarding the NAAQS, I did put a link in our chat, an article one of my colleagues wrote regarding potential changes to the NAAQS, specifically fine particulate matter, PM 2.5. It's our thoughts and considerations around that topic, but we're expecting it to be pretty likely that EPA will revise the NAAQS this year for PM 2.5. So I think it's very possible we'll see some changes to the NAAQS this year. So that's me. I prepared an outline for today, which I will share. Full disclosure, was out of the office for the past 2 weeks and playing a little catch up. So I didn't have a chance to prepare a full presentation, but I do have an outline, and here we go. Can folks see my screen? Someone give me a thumbs up that you see my screen. Thank you. Appreciate it. It's just 2 pages. So I'll expand it and contract it a little bit to draw folks' attention to various parts of it. Should only take a few minutes. I think wanted to touch base on some important distinctions, first of all, which is, I think we've talked about this so far, which is that the wood-fired power plants are basically in a different universe from wood stoves. I mean, they are, relative to wood stoves, very efficient. They include add-on pollution controls. They contain exhaust stacks, which disperse emissions above the ground using momentum, meaning there's a fan that pulls or pushes the exhaust, and buoyancy with a Y, in that the exhaust gases might be around, say, 300-400 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're warmer than the air. So the exhaust is going to go up and disperse thanks to the push from the fan and the heat within the plume. You don't have a fan, for example, with a wood stove, and the emissions or the exhaust are not as warm. Wood-fired power plants are similar, but still distinctively different from the institutional or commercial scale boilers, like ones in schools or hospitals. Those boilers, the institutional commercial ones, will include, have add-on controls, but may not be quite as sophisticated or contain as much to control the emissions. Last but not least, one important distinction is the steam that a steam plume that you will see coming from a stack that vents a wood-fired boiler. Wood fuel has water in it, oftentimes up to, say, 50% water. And so when you heat it, you evaporate the water out. So, on a cold January morning, if you're driving past McNeil or Reigate, you might see a very, very distinctive plume that is really just mostly just water droplets. There is air pollution in there as well, but I think one common misunderstanding is that if you see a large steam plume, what you're seeing is a stack that's belching out uncontrolled emissions. You're seeing water droplets, and those are not regulated by US EPA or Vermont DEC in the air. All right, so moving along here, there's really 2 main types of pollutants that are controlled. There are ones that are particulate and gaseous. For the particulate ones, for particulate matter, we have what's called filterable or solid, solid particles that can be caught on a filter, and then condensable particles. These are like liquid droplets. So as gases cool, they can condense and form liquid droplets. So there are strategies to control both types of particulate matter. As we discussed, what is regulated as PM10 and PM2.5, or particles whose diameter is less than 10 and 2.5 microns respectively. And these are the particles that are respirable, that can get into your lungs. There are, the smaller the particle, the further they can get into your body. But PM10 and 2.5 are what are currently regulated. There are the particulates are also air toxics. Federally, they're related as hazardous air pollutants. In Vermont, they're related as hazardous air contaminants, or HAC. These would be examples of these would be metals, like, for example, chromium. And these metals are taken up by trees that are ultimately converted, or whatever other biomass. They're taken up from the soil. So that's why they show up in the exhaust. So that's a little on particulate pollutants. If we move on to gaseous ones, and again, we've already touched base on these, but common ones are carbon monoxide, CO, nitrogen oxides, or NOx, SO2, sulfur dioxide, and volatile organic compounds. A side note on SO2, I was thinking as we were discussing impacts to the environment, when I was a student at UVM, acid rain was a real big topic. This was in the early 90s. And since then, what the Clean Air Act did was require a lower sulfur fuel content in fossil fuels, meaning fuel oil sulfur content declined from, say, 2%, and nowadays you can't exceed 0.0015%. And as a result, it took a lot of the sulfur out of the fuel, and a lot of that sulfur did not precipitate out of the sky and get into lakes, rivers, and streams. So that's kind of one of the neat things about the Clean Air Act, is that we can make changes to address problems like acid rain, like ozone depletion. Anyway, I digress. I'm going to hop back on topic. There are also air toxics in the gases. Formaldehyde is one that commonly comes up. It's a byproduct of incomplete combustion, so you can minimize it by promoting your combustion completeness, or the degree of combustion efficiency, or combustion efficiency, increasing your degree of combustion completeness. So what you're actually trying to do is oxidize formaldehyde into carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas. So that's another topic for discussion. Hope I didn't set a fire with that one, but that's, balancing the various kinds of pollutants is something that does come up in air permitting. Okay, so moving on to McNeil and Reigate. They are similar facilities. So when we talk about the pollution controls, emissions controls for them, let's just say that one covers both. So they both use the same fuel. They're using natural wood. They both utilize the same add-on pollution controls, and we'll get into those pollution controls in a minute. But before I dive into McNeil and Reigate, I would like to just share a little bit about what I'm calling the three types of controls. So there's what I call upstream, and then end of pipe, and then programmatic. So upstream is, like it says, what's happening upstream? What are we doing early in the process to control emissions? So for McNeil and Reigate, an example would be a requirement to burn natural and clean wood, and not being allowed to burn, say, painted or treated wood, or being allowed to do that, but having to treat that perhaps somewhere further downstream. So we're looking upstream to see what we can do first and foremost, using the old Yankee ingenuity to control emissions. And then there's what I call end of pipe. So this is, these are pollution controls that are installed before the stack. So the exhaust goes through them, it gets filtered out, and then it goes out of the stack. And as I mentioned, the exhaust gases are dispersed using momentum provided by a fan and buoyancy provided by the heat of the exhaust gas.
Hey, John.
Yes.
I'm really sorry to interrupt, and I want to let you finish, but I also just want to be mindful of time, and just wanted to ask if you could do this in about 5 more minutes, so we would be done around 9:50, just so there was time to wrap up and still have public comment.
Yeah, in fact,
Thank you so much.
no problem. So the two type of end of pipe controls at these wood-fired power plants are first an electrostatic precipitator, ESP, which functions a little bit like a magnet. It charges particles in the exhaust gas and has collector plates that are oppositely charged and pull the particles out. So that controls the particulate pollutants like PM10 and PM2.5. The second control device is called, this is a lot of words and letters here, but there's selective catalytic and selective non-catalytic reduction, SCR and SNCR. And in short, this is a device that converts nitrogen oxides, NOx, to atmospheric nitrogen. So an ESP and SCR and SNCR are the add-on controls. And last, what I call is programmatic controls. And as Megan mentioned, these power plants are regulated by a permitting program. They're what's called major sources. So there are a lot of requirements that they have to meet. The permits they have are what's called legally enforceable. They are legally enforceable. So if they don't perform a requirement that's in their permits, they can get in trouble. The permits, though, do require quite a bit to make sure that the equipment is working. So there are what's called monitoring, record keeping, and reporting requirements. So with regard to monitoring, there's what's called a continuous opacity monitoring system, where you're measuring how visible the plume is as a way of measuring the concentration of particulates in the plume. And there's a continuous emissions monitoring system that where you're monitoring the emissions rate, or actually the concentration of gases, including NOx, in the stack. There's actual source emissions testing that has to be performed, where you're measuring the level of emissions in the stack to make sure it's below the permit limit. And then there's equipment performance monitoring, where there are regular checks you have to perform on the pollution control equipment. So for example, secondary power is something that has to be checked on an ESP. In other words, you have to make sure that there's power going to the ESP to verify that it's actually doing the work. Second to last, record keeping. All the data that is monitored essentially has to be kept on file for, I believe, at least 5 years. So the state and with Vermont and EPA may periodically review records that are being kept. And oftentimes there are reports that have to be submitted that are based on the record. So ultimately these facilities, one way or another, have to report to state of Vermont or EPA. So it's just real high level. I am done and happy to entertain questions.
Thanks, everyone. So let's really briefly, if there are any other questions from the task group for John, thank you, Megan or Jared, let's hear those now if we have that, and then mindful that we're behind schedule on public comment, be thoughtful that we'd like to shift to public comment so that we don't have to all scatter for those public comments. And then I'll do my best to wrap up and give you a preview of the next few meetings to see if they feel on track with the work plan we've highlighted. Judy, please go ahead.
Yes, I was just responding to Jared's comment about not being aware of any evidence of outdoor issues. But what about asthma and cancers? Do we know if there are any cluster spots in this state where there might be high number of upper respiratory issues or cancers?
And I'm sorry, Judy, I don't know the answers to those questions. I can ask. I don't know that we have asthma data to the level of scale that would be needed to answer that question. I can check with our cancer registry program and see if they have anything that could help answer that question. So that one's more likely that I could answer for you, but I'll check and follow back up with the task group.
Thank you.
Sure.
Not seeing any other hands right now, and mindful that we're behind on public comment per usual. Why don't we shift to public comment for a minute and then come back to the task group? Anyone here from the public who would like to ask a question or make a comment right now? Well, that's easy. Got us back on track. Oh, Cheryl, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Jane. Yeah, I think that looking at maps with clusters of health impacts are available for most things these days. I don't know where to find that kind of thing, but I have heard about it. And I wanted to point out my comment in the chat about thermal pollution downwind and downstream of all power plants. So that's a major consideration as well. I didn't really hear much about that this time around, except for to hear that the steam is not doing anything but being water, so which it does do more than. That's it. I like response. No, I don't just want to say this and have it written down. I think that it would be great for people to address it and respond to it rather than just note it.
I have a quick question then, Cheryl. When you say thermal impacts downstream from all power plants, do you mean literally in water or downstream in the atmosphere? I don't believe
of both. It's both, Billy. There are
okay.
impacts in both.
Great. I wasn't aware that these wood-fired plants had any sort of water discharge, but I could be wrong there.
Sure, I can.
You are wrong with Billy. They do have water discharge.
Okay.
They have temperature controls on what the temperature of the water discharge has to be.
Into the Winooski?
Yep.
Thanks.
Don, were you going to respond to that?
Yeah, in terms of above ground in the air, there are no federal or state requirements that I'm aware of that regulate the temperature or that address thermal impacts downwind. There are, directly and indirectly requirements that encourage these facilities to be as efficient as possible to recover as much heat as possible from the burning of wood in this case. So the more heat you recover, the more heat you discharge in the plume of exhaust from the stack. So there's really no direct thermal requirements on wood-fired boilers.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't talking about requirements, but impacts, because a lot of things there aren't requirements for or regulations for, but they're still making a tremendous impact. So I'm not really talking about that, regulations, etc. But
right, I get my point's just that without I guess what I would say is to clarify is without a regulation requiring an impact evaluation, there won't be an impact evaluation unless a facility chooses on its own to conduct one. I'm not aware that, thermal emissions from stacks are having any kind of significant impact. I have heard about directly about how thermal discharges into water can impact what's in the water, but I'm not aware of it impacting birds in the air, but I haven't looked into it either. So,
yeah, maybe I'm sure I know that there are studies out there. So maybe that's a point for the task group to look at. Thanks.
Thank you, Cheryl. Annette, please go ahead.
Yes, good morning. This is Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I want to be respectful here, but I have to say that I didn't really learn anything today. What I feel like I heard was a lot of sort of deflection. I mean, I want to know what the emissions are from these two tree burning power plants and what the local impacts are. And so, for instance, Rygate the emissions, the prevailing winds go off to the east. That's going into New Hampshire. It's going into an area that is, wildlife habitat. So there's that. In Burlington, it's people. And, what I learned today was residential wood burning is a lot worse than the tree burning plants, but I didn't learn what the tree burning plants are actually doing. And I don't find that these sort of percentage presentations are helpful. And to the question of, what are the cancer and asthma rates? I mean, those are real questions, and we're not hearing any actual information. I live near Rutland. If anybody has ever seen the inversion in Rutland, you understand why Rutland has such bad air. I mean, in the winter with the wood burning stoves there and the heavy blanket that falls into that bowl, it's really something. And so I've seen it there. What are the equivalent things happening around the biomass plant in the residential areas in Burlington? So I'm just, I did mention that two decades ago, there was a Vermont committee to ensure clean air. It was a high-level committee. I served on it for 1.5 years with a lot of people. It's one of my frustrations of being relegated to the bleacher seats in this discussion is that I can't be a part of it. I apologize for breaking the rules and posting in the chat, but I actually have to leave right now. And I didn't know that you get to public comment before the meeting ended. But I do have things to offer. And, we got tremendous education on all kinds of air pollutants, transportation. It was really an amazing education that we got. And nothing ever came of it, including that I'm one of the few people left who was on that committee, and my knowledge isn't valued anymore. So I'm trying to be constructive here, but I want to know what the health impacts are from those 2 power plants. I do not want to hear about all of this other stuff that's going on that we all know is bad. I mean, I think one of the things I learned today is that burning oil is a better thing for health than burning wood. Is that what you want the outcome to be of this? I mean, if you want to do it by percentages, hey, oil and gas looks a whole lot healthier than wood in your house. And I'm not here to promote the fossil fuel industry, but I would like to learn about the emissions from these plants. So thank you very much for hearing me.
Thanks, Annette. And I'm mindful that as we start to think about work planning and how we move forward, we might, as a group, want to consider having an extended public comment period as we think to draft our recommendations in other subcommittees. Actually in subcommittees, it's a task group we've held. Just transitions in particular comes to mind as of late, knowing that public comment can be shortchanged and is really important to the development of the recommendations. We could have an extended public comment period at the beginning or substantively in the meeting. So I want to be mindful of wrapping up, but Sharon, yeah, I see your hand. I was about to go to you. Thank you.
Great. I just want to add one real quick thing after Annette. I too don't want to endorse gas, fossil fuels and heat, but having looked at learned more about the carbon footprint of biomass, including all types of biomass. And I think that it seems, even looking at Bill Keaton's graphs, that it seems like it's better to use oil or gas than wood in most applications. And that also brings me to the scope of this group is that, it's titled Biomass Task Group. And I know the scope has been whittled here and there and changed and et cetera. But it really does seem that if this is really a climate and group, for the Vermont Climate Council, you might want to just actually look at biomass. I mean, it's not like, okay, well, it's doing one thing here and different thing there. It's making the same effect, you're looking at biomass. Like, don't just ignore all the other stuff and only focus on. But that's just probably after you finish with the power plants. But I encourage you all or us to continue with biomass after those questions are answered and not fold up the group. So that's it.
Thanks, Cheryl. We did bring that up with the steering committee, and we'll reevaluate the work of this task group as we finish the initial scope of the work. So before we wrap up, I do just want to say that on our agenda, we had hoped to sort of start to talk about work planning for the development of the actual recommendations from this group. And hopefully we can provide some more substantive time to do that at our next meeting. What Pat and I discussed that I want to test with you all and offer you the chance to follow up with me directly, individually, between now and our next meeting is that we'd like to wrap up the information gathering on the electricity plants at our next meeting. And my thought is I have spoken to Darren Springer from Burlington Electric Department and asked him specifically of him and his staff and consultants who could speak to us specifically about the thermal heat application of these facilities. I suspect as we've worked through the information that we've been learning about, that the consideration for where we would consider expansion of any of these facilities is directly linked still to the thermal application of them. So understanding why, after having them permitted for so long and that being part of the original permit for McNeil, what have been the challenges to actually seeing that through and where they are in the process, and the impacts of that is really important to this group. So Darren Springer has offered to join our next meeting, and he's also invited the consultant who's worked most closely with BED on investigation of thermal application. So I'd like to extend that invitation to have them join the next meeting. Also, more than happy to consider any other consultants or outside sort of the inside baseball loop of like why that hasn't moved forward. So please follow up directly with me if you have any recommendations of a counter argument, then directly from hearing from BED. And so happy to have a more inclusive conversation and offer, please reach out to me directly on that. So happy to take a comment now, but also appreciate that we're past 10 o'clock and happy to workshop the next meeting with any of you offline between now and then. Judy, go ahead.
Jane, could we also have some of the information that we asked for in today's meeting and have a slot on the agenda next time to talk about some of this stuff?
With respect to the specific health issues around the plants, is that in particular? Yes, I can try to work closely with others to see if I can get any of that information. I suspect having both of those presentations in one meeting will push us way over. So what I'd like to do is try to follow up directly with sharing information around any further health research that we have. Share that with you, post it online as a task group, and then if I can do that in a timely fashion, at the end of next meeting, if there are still lingering questions or need for additional presentations, then we can look to a future meeting to do that. And then finally, I'll just say one other comment about work planning. If and when we sort of are ready to sort of move to recommendation development around biomass electricity plants, my intent is to shift to wood flow, the conversation around wood flow. I understand from your meeting last week that there's still sort of like how broad we take that is a little bit of debate, but as a first step, Fish and Wildlife staff who are looking at and reviewing harvests and can speak to what the authority is on looking at harvests have agreed to also come in and join us and offered to invite the forester for Rygate so we can speak specifically to how that process works with ANR. And so that's a future meeting conversation too, and would actually be able to, for us to look specifically at leverage points of how we regulate harvests around these sites. Billy, go ahead.
Just a quick clarifying question. You're talking about moving or developing recommendations related to the electric generation plants. I'm not clear what that means. And I think most importantly, I think we've long discussed trying to better understand the market value and positive influence that that market has over long-term stewardship of forested landscape in Vermont. So I think it's important to me to understand, we've heard a lot about the downside of these facilities. It would be good to understand kind of the perceived upside of them as well before making any recommendations.
Thank you for that. Okay, well, really interested in all of this. Thank you for staying late as per usual. And we'll look forward to hearing any comments from any of you individually or to advance the agendas for the next few meetings. So thanks so much for our guest speakers, for Jared and John being here today. Thanks so much. Have a nice day, everyone.
Jane, did you see the last comment that I posted? Because you're looking at other speakers and they're skewed.
Yes, thanks,
so
Carol.
far.
I save the chat with the meetings too. So thank you for that.
Yep. Thanks.
Have a nice day.
You too. Bye.